we'll take it from there. So after finding psychedelics useful in providing relief from her own mysterious autoimmune condition, Caitlin was inspired to contribute to bringing psychedelics to the forefront of modern medicine. Marrying her passions of psychedelics and health, Caitlin provides educational tools regarding psychedelics, including harm reduction, mental wellness, and healing chronic illness. She is currently a producer of the Aware Project San Diego events and previously worked in psychedelic QEEG research. Caitlin received her undergraduate degree in neurobiology from San Diego State University and is pursuing research on psychedelic compounds and implications for autoimmune conditions. And the topic for talk is psychedelics as a novel approach to autoimmune diseases. So let's welcome Caitlin.
All right, I'm trying to decide if I should stand on this side or this side. This side works. Brad, I'll just do that to change sides. Okay, so thank you all for coming. My name is Caitlin, as you know by now, and you can go ahead and change slides. So, like any sort of ambitious path, it usually starts with a story, and it certainly did for me. And with my particular story, I was struggling with depression and anxiety. And it was actually when I was about 18 years old, I started exploring with psychedelic drugs and other things like MDMA. I was going to raves and then using LSD and then Burning Man and then I was doing my neurobiology degree, and I started to get more serious about the harder classes like organic chemistry and biochemistry. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna kind of take a break from partying and thus take a break from psychedelic substances. And what I found was actually really interesting. And about the 7th to 8th week mark after my last psychedelic experience, I noticed I was beginning to physiologically unravel and become more irritable and more kind of mentally disorganized and more depressed and more anxious. And it was clearly physiological because nothing circumstantially was really changing in my life. I was very happy with where I was at. And it took me about 3 or 4 times of this occurring before I finally figured out that I had actually been effectively medicating with psychedelic compounds for an underlying physiologically based depression and anxiety. And then it started me on this whole rabbit hole of a health journey where I actually started to see that all these symptoms that I had had my whole life were related to my newfound discovery of my depression and anxiety. As a child, I was very thin. I was probably not absorbing nutrients. I had chronic fatigue my entire life. I had skin issues. I had joint pain. I was just a hypersensitive individual. I wasn't very resilient to stress. I felt wimpy and pathetic compared to other people. And people said, no, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you. And I knew something deep down that there was something wrong. And so later, after I kind of accidentally went down this whole health journey discovery that is continuing to unfold for me as we speak, but I discovered that there was a lot of things that were contributing to this chronic inflammatory autoimmune state that I was actually in. I had a Lyme disease infection. I had a number of gut and central nervous system infections. I had food sensitivities. I had some emotional trauma that had been stored in my physiology and manifested as what you could classify as PTSD if you looked at my brain mapping EEG. And I lived in a moldy house for almost 5 years, and my dog also developed all these autoimmune problems. So that was also a big trigger. So what is an autoimmune disease? Well, as you can see by this definition and this lovely illustrating picture, an autoimmune disease develops when your body's immune system treats healthy cells in the body as foreign cells and begins to attack these healthy cells. So essentially an autoimmune disease refers to any illness or disorder that occurs when healthy tissue is being destroyed by the body's own immune system, hence punching herself in the face. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but there is a global health crisis happening right now with autoimmune conditions. So chronic illness, which encompasses autoimmune conditions, but is not, explicitly autoimmune conditions. But I would say autoimmune etiology is a part of almost all chronic illnesses that we see. And it's the most severe threat to global economic development because it's debilitating for a lot of people. And it costs $100 billion a year just in the United States to treat autoimmune conditions. That's a shit ton of money. And about 10 to 20% of the global population is diagnosed as having autoimmune conditions. And in America, it's more like 30%, almost a third. So there's approximately 50 million people in America that have been diagnosed with autoimmune conditions. And you know what, there's probably actually more than that because doctors aren't that good at figuring it out, at least in conventional medicine at this point. To give you an idea of how many people that is, 9 million people in the US have heart disease and, not heart disease, cancer. 9 million people have cancer in the US. 22 million have heart disease. 50 million have autoimmune conditions. That's a lot. And also taking all these statistics into account, they're actually only looking at the most common 6 or so autoimmune conditions. There's actually over 100 defined autoimmune conditions. And what's interesting is they all affect different organ systems, they all express differently, but the etiology seems to be the same. The origin, the mechanistic origin in the body seems to be quite universal for all of these conditions, which is kind of helpful in some cases because, it's like you can kind of, solve all of them by really focusing on the same cure. But it's curious, Let's go ahead and switch. So some examples of autoimmune conditions: fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease, IBS, colitis, celiac, almost virtually any sort of gut inflammatory disorder, multiple sclerosis, eczema, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, ALS, ankylosing spondylitis, Hashimoto's or thyroiditis, autism, type 1 diabetes, and actually they're in the process of classifying type 2 diabetes as having an autoimmune origin as well, and then the neurodegenerative diseases as well, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. They're starting to realize that, again, the etiology, these mechanisms are very similar across the board with autoimmune diseases. So, some symptoms of autoimmune conditions. Again, it looks like a lot of different things, which is in part why it's been difficult for Western doctors to diagnose them correctly, because they're a very, sort of cut and dry, methodical approach, but they are failing to see the relationship between all of these symptoms. So excessive inflammation and oxidative stress, that's, I would say, the sort of cornerstone of what you see in autoimmune conditions. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria produce energy for the cells. A hypervigilant, but also suppressed immune system. So your immune system is overactive in some ways and underactive in others, so imbalanced, I would say, or dysfunctional. A dysregulated nervous system. There tends to be something called glutamate excitotoxicity occurring, which I'll talk more about later. Psychiatric conditions. This one is huge for me because I tend to specialize in mood disorders, and so many people fail to understand that a lot of these psychiatric conditions are neuroinflammatory conditions, and they don't see, we're starting to figure out, the gut and the brain are related. Yeah, but they're also, these psychiatric conditions are a lot of autoimmune stuff going on. digestive gut problems, including malabsorption, which means you're not absorbing nutrients such as vitamins, minerals, and amino acids that help the nervous system function, and every part of the body for that matter. Food sensitivities causing this chronic inflammation and immune response, chronic fatigue, skin problems, eczema, dermatitis, things of that sort, sensitivity to pain, fibromyalgia, muscle stiffness and joint pain, poor brain health and cognition, brain fog, susceptibility to infections or just like reoccurring colds all the time, and a lot more. But those are just kind of the main ones. So what causes an autoimmune condition? Sorry, this was a little fuzzy. So as you can see, it's multifactorial. But look at the smallest, or I guess it's kind of the same as the autoimmune disease in the circle, genetics. Everyone says, oh, it's in my genes, that's why. There's nothing I can do about it, therefore I should just take this drug and not try. It's bullshit. Genetics, they predispose you. Certainly, some people have a certain genome that makes them more or less likely to develop an autoimmune condition. But environmental triggers, that's kind of really what causes it. And as you can see here, leaky gut. How many of you guys know what leaky gut is? A few people? Okay. Unfortunately, I won't get to talk about it a ton, but part of the origin that they've kind of started to agree upon in the literature is that leaky gut is where it starts. So what leaky gut is, just real quickly, so you have this very thin layer of tissue lining the gut of your entire GI tract, and your cells are they're held together with these things called tight junctions. And nutrients, as they get digested and absorbed, the cells very specifically grab certain nutrients and then they shuttle them across the cell, and that's how they make sure they know exactly what's going into the bloodstream, and that they don't just grab like a bacteria and put it in your bloodstream and give you sepsis or something, right? So what happens is bacterial overgrowths or gluten or certain inflammatory foods or chemicals, antibiotics, they actually destroy these tight junctions that are holding the cells together, and you start to get these gaps in your epithelial layer of your gut, and so it becomes kind of like a cheesecloth, and there's this increased permeability. So now you have giant undigested food particles, or even sometimes bacteria, just going straight into the bloodstream through these giant gaping holes that are essentially damaged. And say you have pieces of blueberry fragments that haven't been cut up into the little pieces of amino acids that they need to be in order for your body to utilize them. You have these undigested fragments, they're going through these holes, they're going straight into the bloodstream, and your body's like, what the hell is that? It doesn't belong there, it's not something I recognize, let's launch an immune response. Next thing you know, you have an allergy to blueberries. And that's how you start to develop the food sensitivities. And over time, when this is happening a lot, your body develops a hyper-vigilant response every time you're eating food, because food is just leaking out into your bloodstream and it's creating a lot of chaos. So hopefully that was too long. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so causes of autoimmunity. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of different causes, but it really comes down to a chronic stressor. Whether it's microbial dysbiosis, which the microbiome is basically the population of organisms that live in your GI tract that we're finding are more and more relevant to health and even aspects of our personality and who we are and our brain function. Very interesting. So when we have a dysbiosis or just like an imbalance of microbial populations, maybe there's not enough of these guys, or these guys have started over-dominating and are bullying everybody and crowding them out, that creates health problems for us. It creates disease states, it creates inflammation. And we can also consider that a gut infection. Sometimes a gut infection is a bacteria that really doesn't belong there, and sometimes it's an organism that kind of belongs there, but is maybe gotten a little bit too big and ambitious, such as Candida. Candida, it's not actually a bacteria, it's a yeast, but everyone knows Candida overgrowth, right? Candida plays a really important role in our microbiome balance, but when it becomes overgrown, it's considered a pathogen and therefore an infection. Or you can have things like Klebsiella pneumoniae or Enterobacter or even E. coli, H. pylori overgrowth, stuff of that sort. And also, chronic infections that aren't just in the gut, such as Lyme's disease, herpes virus, Epstein-Barr. There's a number of different bugs that can live and burrow in various organ systems. Lyme disease loves the nervous system, so it's particularly detrimental on brain health and nervous system health. And so that's a significant stressor on the body. When there's a chronic infection and the body is for whatever reason not able to eradicate it, specifically Lyme and herpes and Epstein-Barr, they're really good at hiding from the immune system, which is unfortunate. Now emotional trauma, that's also a chronic stressor. Maybe you have a shitty boss at work and every day you go to your job and you're like, I hate this. That's going to make you more susceptible to things like microbes and just create a lot of inflammatory dysfunction in the system. Something that's really interesting is that they've actually done some research looking at the connection of emotional trauma and the incidence of developing an autoimmune condition. And some interesting stats for you guys. So 65% of women with fibromyalgia have had sexual abuse as a child. 65%. That's kind of a lot, right? That doesn't seem random. It doesn't seem like an average for just the universal population. So there's something going on there. And women with 3 or more adversive childhood events, that's an actual term, had 60% more likelihood to be hospitalized in their lifetime for an autoimmune disease. So there's something going on there. And in my opinion, this is actually perfectly explainable by modern science. If you put the nervous system and you traumatize it and it goes into a chronic stress response, such as you see with PTSD, then it's going to get stuck in this chronic sympathetic overdrive. It's going to burn through dopamine and norepinephrine, and cortisol is going to be through the roof, and the immune system says, we don't need to care about that because we're worried about running from the lion right now, and you don't digest food as effectively because you're also running from the lion, and that's not important at the moment. And so it develops all sorts of physiological problems that downstream, from the nervous system, screws up inflammatory processes, it screws up immune function, it screws up hormones, pretty much everything. If you guys know what detrimental stress is, it sucks. Also exposure to toxins, food toxins, even if it's just an allergy, maybe you're sensitive to gluten. As I said, we know that gluten does damage tight junctions. That's not made up, that's in the literature. Things like, some proteins from dairy are inflammatory for people. Sometimes it's something like melon, everyone's got their weird immune response food. There's toxins in the air, toxins in our water. There's chemicals everywhere, in our pillows, in our plastic water bottles, in our clothes, everything. Mold, huge one. A lot of people that develop autoimmune problems usually have some sort of sensitivity to mold or have been exposed to mold. Household items, cleaners, bleaches, shampoos, again with chemicals. And then advanced glycated end products, which are usually something that happens in very sugary, carbohydrate-rich foods or junk foods, or like hydrogenated oils and stuff like that. So, simple, but illustrating, right? So I just wanted to talk about the difference between acute and chronic inflammation. So if I smack my hand on the table, I'm gonna be like, ow, and it's inflamed, and that's a good thing. It's going, my body is sending all sorts of things to the area, and the inflammation is actually trying to heal and protect from, damaged tissue and any opportunistic microbes that might be like, yes, the cell is split open, I'm gonna go in and infect it. my body's there using inflammation as a tool to help heal that area and make sure that it you know, is all right. But when you have chronic inflammation, the inflammation starts to turn against you and it starts to actually damage your own tissues. And so when I'm talking about inflammation, I just kind of wanted to redeem inflammation as a whole, that it plays a really crucial function in our physiology, but when it's chronic, that's when you have to start looking at, why is the body chronically inflamed? What chronic stressor is it having trouble coping with? Okay, now I'm going to get a little scientific. Hopefully it's not too much. So, the 5-HT system, also known as the serotonergic system. 5-HT stands for 5-hydroxytryptamine, which is a fancy word for serotonin. So, just to give you guys a little bit of background on the serotonergic system and how that's related to immune function and inflammation. So there's 14 receptor subtypes of the serotonergic system. And what's interesting about serotonin is it mediates both excitatory and inhibitory effects. Usually when you have a neurotransmitter such as dopamine or GABA or acetylcholine, it's usually excitatory or inhibitory. But what's interesting about serotonin system is that it's relatively half and half, which hints that it's very modulating and regulating and balancing. So we'll talk a lot about the 5-HT2A receptor, and it's densely, I guess, located in mammalian lymphoid tissue, which is interesting. And again, we'll talk about why that's relevant to psychedelics. It controls a number of downstream pathways involving neurotransmitter release and hormones, and it is particularly important for regulating the glutamate system, which I will talk more about later. It plays a role in immune modulation and inflammation, including things like chemotaxis, leukocyte activation, proliferation of cells, anergy, which is basically the absence of an immune response, cytokine secretion, and apoptosis, cell death. 80 to 90% of serotonin synthesis actually occurs in the gut, which is really interesting, and only about 5% is made in the brain. And what's also interesting about serotonin receptors is their function is very cell specific. So a serotonin receptor in a neuron or brain cell is not necessarily going to do the same thing as it is in a cell in lymphoid tissue or in the GI tract. And it just kind of highlights the diversity and the heterogeneity to suggest that it plays a wide range in immunomodulatory effects. All right. So now you can see why this matters. So the classical psychedelics, you know, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, ibogaine is that classical kind of. MDMA is not like a true psychedelic in this sense. Neither is ketamine. The DOX series, the 2C series. A majority of these are 5-HT2A receptor agonists. They bind to this particular serotonin subtype receptor. And they're generally full or partial agonists depending on the compound. And you can see here, just real quickly, there's serotonin, there's DMT, there's psilocin, LSD. They all have that common indole structure, which makes sense why they would fit into the same receptor key and lock. All right? Okay, so, oh, these are out of order. Sorry. Somehow I got rid of that one. Anyways, so the signal 1 receptor, currently I only know of DMT as a psychedelic that's binding to it. And DMT is an agonist of this receptor. And signal 1 is interesting because it resides on the endoplasmic reticulum and plays a role in mitochondrial function. And as I mentioned earlier, mitochondrial dysfunction is a huge problem in autoimmune disease. And that's in part why people have chronic fatigue and stuff, because the mitochondria are damaged and they can't pump out energy. So the signal 1 receptor appears to regulate calcium signaling affecting mitochondrial function and inhibiting apoptosis or cell death. We see that a lot in like neurodegenerative diseases. The mitochondria are dying, the calcium is doing weird things, and the cell just goes, screw it, I'm done, I'm gonna die. And then you have basically neurodegeneration happening. We also have seen that the sigma-1 receptor modulates these transcription factors such as nuclear factor kappa B and mitogen activating protein kinase, which play a crucial role in inflammatory processes and immune function. The sigma-1 dysfunction, as I said, has been implicated in neurodegenerative diseases. Okay, inflammation. So this is some stuff highlighting what we do know about psychedelics and inflammation. So we actually have a little bit of research so far. We've seen that LSD inhibits interleukin 2, 4, and 6 secretion of B cells. Those are pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are signaling molecules. DMT has been found to increase anti-inflammatory interleukin 10 and decrease interleukin 1 beta, 6, TNF alpha, which is also an inflammatory cytokine, and the chemokine CXCL8 and interleukin 8. DOI, which is like an LSD analog, I believe, has been found to reduce TNF alpha mediate inflammatory cytokines via the 5-HT2A receptor in rats. And we know this because when they give the rats a drug that blocks that receptor, they do not see the reduction in the TNF alpha. So we know, at least in this particular case, it's likely directly mediated by this receptor activation. And then, as I kind of talked before, DMT and the sigma-1 receptor, they influence calcium levels and affect transcription factors such as these guys, I won't say them again, and they directly play a role in the gene expression of, cellular proliferation, survival, and the creation and release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And autoimmunity and inflammation have this sort of vicious feedback cycle. You start getting the immune system attacking healthy cells, and then the inflammation processes are part of the immune system. They go and they create inflammation to help clean up the area, but then the inflammation creates more confusion for the immune system, and it spirals down and can get out of control. All right, so glutamate excitotoxicity. Does anyone know what that is? Yes. No? I'm glad a few people know what it is. Oddly enough, a lot of people, even in neuroscience and medicine, aren't familiar with this concept, which blows my mind. Anyways, so, as I mentioned, glutamate excitotoxicity is quite rampant in the mechanisms of autoimmune conditions. And what happens is you get an oversensitization and overexcitation of neurons by them being activated in their glutamate receptors. And it creates what's called an action potential, which is basically an electrical current that runs through the cell, then it gets propagated into the next cell, and that's how neural communication works, right? So what happens when glutamate activates the receptor, it causes an influx of calcium into the cell, which ends up releasing reactive oxygen species from the mitochondria, and they're basically free radicals, which, as you guys have probably heard, aren't so good for you. And so free radicals create something called oxidative stress. They actually damage cell structures, and especially the fatty membrane of the cell, because it's basically all fat, and fats are like the first thing to be oxidized. This results in damage and shriveling to dendrites and synaptic spines, and if it is really hitting the cell hard, the cell can actually explode and die, apoptosis. And so on a larger scale, this ends up showing up as brain atrophy and neurodegeneration. So, how do psychedelics appear to mediate this excitotoxicity? So, ketamine is probably the best example of this. Again, not a classical psychedelic, but the NMDA receptor. and it appears to be neuroprotective against glutamate excitotoxicity. And because it's blocking this particular receptor, it's kind of redirecting glutamate to bind to the other types of glutamate receptors, such as the kainate and the AMPA, which seems to normalize calcium levels and reduce the oxidative stress load, reduce the inflammation, the cellular damage, and in essence, the disease. And also, the serotonergic system, as I mentioned before, downstream modulates glutamate, which can combat excitotoxicity. It kind of like helps balance out this hyper-vigilant and excitable system. So, another really cool thing about psychedelics that's relevant to brain function is they upregulate this neuronal growth factor called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And basically it prompts the growth and repair of new neurons and dendrites and synaptic spines, which are all good things that we want. And so far, at least in my familiarity, DMT, psilocybin, ketamine, probably LSD, ibogaine, and harmine, which is an MAOI in ayahuasca, have been shown conclusively to upregulate this neuronal growth protein. That's kind of a big deal. And you see in neurodegenerative diseases and depression and psychiatric illnesses, this protein is downregulated and their brain is literally deteriorating. There's deterioration and shrinkages of structures, even in depression. People go, oh, okay, neurodegenerative diseases, you would expect that. But in depression, people are having atrophy of the hippocampus and the amygdala, and they have not enough BDNF. So psychedelics, even just by this mechanism alone, that's huge. So BDNF can also help you recoup damage from the autoimmune mechanisms that are happening and damaging brain tissue, oxidative stress, the inflammation associated with it. And the reason this is being upregulated is likely because of downstream glutamate receptor activation from these psychedelic compounds. We're still kind of figuring that out. There's some speculation that some of the psychedelics are actually binding directly to glutamate receptors, but there's kind of some controversy about that. And this is especially implicated for neurological and psychiatric conditions. Immune system. So this one's kind of interesting. In a study they did, they found that high doses of LSD inhibit natural killer cells. So natural killer cells are immune cells, and they basically go around and look for bad guys to kick their ass, And so we found that in high doses, it actually doesn't really help them. But in low doses, below 0.1 micromoles, it actually increases them, which for me creates some implications about the benefits of microdosing. DMT increases natural killer cells, allegedly, and harmine has been found to inhibit basically herpes simplex 2 virus, and has also shown antifungal, antimicrobial, and antioxidant properties. That's great for someone that has a chronic infection, especially with a fungus or a bacteria or a virus, and is having rampant oxidative stress. Harmine also seems to increase natural killer cells, specifically for antiviral and anti-cancer effects. So this is a topic that I think is very intriguing, and I would like people to start thinking about it more. So as I mentioned earlier, these microbial populations in our gut, they play a huge role in our brain health and whole body health in general. And the gut-brain axis is really intriguing. And actually the brain communicates with the gut, and the gut communicates with the brain. It is a two-way street, and they both influence each other. And by calming the nervous system or improving the health of the nervous system, you will inadvertently improve the health of your gut, and vice versa. But the nervous system sends signals down to the gut, which will ultimately dictate what environment that gut is, how inflamed it is, the pH, whatever. which will influence what microbial populations live there, aka if you have a balanced gut ecology. So I find that psychedelics seem to restore vagal nerve tone and balance, and the vagal nerve is really important for communicating between the gut and the brain, and also just regulating the autonomic nervous system in general. There, again, is some antimicrobial activity, especially in the harmine that we've seen, and I'm guessing that that has implications for preventing or even improving gut dysbiosis or mild overgrowths in the gut, or even an inflamed environment in the gut that's creating opportunity for pathogenic bacteria to live there. And this one here is where I couldn't find shit on the internet, and I don't think anyone's done any research on it. What happens when you expose bacteria to psychedelics? Do you guys know? I don't. I want to know though, because you know, these tryptamines, these trace amines, tryptophan, they're so highly conserved in biology. They're obviously important. Almost every life form utilizes amino acids, which makes me think that they might have receptors that these psychedelics could bind to. And what would that do to their behavior? And how would that benefit or may perhaps be detrimental to us? I personally think that it'd more benefit us, just because I'm kind of dogmatic about psychedelics at this point. But I want to know. So if you guys know anyone doing microbiology research, give them my number. Okay. These are all out of order. Psychedelic emotional effects. How many of you guys feel like psychedelics have had an emotional benefit for you? Yeah, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, emotional trauma is a huge trigger for autoimmune conditions. And psychedelics seem to be great at resolving emotional trauma and releasing stored trauma from the physicality of the nervous system. And they also help to kind of recalibrate a brain that's stuck in a sympathetic stress response, and allow opportunity for that brain to be retrained, especially given the neuroplasticity that they provide. So that's huge. And also, they tend to induce mystical experience, as you guys know from the work that Griffiths has done at Johns Hopkins. And mystical experiences, you know, there's a link between spirituality and psychological well-being. We know that intuitively, but there's also some science just to make sure that we believe it. So if psychedelics are inducing these mystical experiences, that is inevitably benefiting our entire holistic well-being. So, in summary, there's obviously some hints that there's immune and inflammatory modulation happening via the serotonergic system being activated and the sigma-1 receptor, inducing these intercellular calcium fluctuations, which are affecting transcription factors related to cytokine production, aka inflammation processes. And we find that, you know, we're seeing reduced inflammation and oxidative stress potentially based on these mechanisms. We're finding that psychedelics appear to be neuroprotective and regenerative to brain cells and brain cell structures. They're probably having some microbiome effects. If they're affecting the nervous system, they're affecting the gut. We just don't know how yet. Nobody's looked at it. And they're helping us resolve emotional trauma, which, as this crowd probably knows, obviously affects our physical health and our spiritual well-being. You know, it's not just about our physical bodies. There's something deeper. There's something deeper in why we thrive and why we don't. So next slide. And I just want to mention too, as much as I am a proponent of psychedelics, do I think they are the sole answer to curing someone's autoimmune condition? No. They've been an incredible tool for me, but I have utilized a lot of different things, and I don't think I would have been able to be in remission without all of those things. They all played a really crucial role. And so I just kind of want to make an emphasis that psychedelics, they're likely not going to be the cure. They're going to help you unravel this, and they're going to help you manage the inflammation and the immune dysfunction until you figure out what that chronic stressor is. What is the root cause? Do you have a shitty boss that's stressing you out? Do you have some completely unconscious childhood trauma that you don't even know exists that is keeping your nervous system in this chronic sympathetic state? Do you have mold in your house? Are you allergic to bread and you're eating bread every day? You need to find that out, because psychedelics can only do so much to mediate this fuel on the fire that's happening. So I want to make that clear. And again, multiple modalities. Psychedelics are a tool, not the tool. And I do think it's important to address both the physiological, emotional, and spiritual aspects of the person, because they're all different expressions of the same truth of your being. And again, address trauma, clean up the microbiome, clear out gut infections, microbial overgrowths, and dysbiosis. Get adequate nutrition. Sometimes you don't get, even if you eat amazing, you don't get enough nutrition from your food because your gut is not absorbing it correctly, or you have some biological need for 3 times the amount of B6 as somebody else next to you. That's very common. Diet, exercise, your lifestyle, your social relationships, how stimulated you are. There's a lot of things that go into recovering from an autoimmune condition or creating an autoimmune condition, and those all need to be addressed, and perhaps with psychedelics sprinkled on top. This is just real quickly the functional medicine model. I'm a big fan of functional medicine, and you can see on the side, maybe a little small for you guys, structural integrity. So things like, are the membranes working? Are the muscular skeletal structure of the body working? Communication. Are the neurotransmitters communicating? Transport. Is the lymphatic system transporting things around effectively? Etc., etc. Those are all the physiological things that you can evaluate. But in the middle, mental, emotional, and spiritual. If those aren't sorted out, none of that shit matters, and none of this stuff can thrive if this is in a knot and blocked. So I just kind of want to emphasize the importance of holistically treating the whole person, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and biophysically. Next one. And I also want to say that I'm looking to pursue some research in this. I would really love to do some very simple studies looking at inflammatory biomarkers in the blood, maybe microbiome stool analysis, which have gotten pretty good and extensive at this point. So if there's anybody that is interested in collaborating on a research project, I especially need someone who's published, is a postdoc, and maybe has some way to get some money. All the things, really. But aside from that, if you feel like reaching out to me, I really encourage you to do so. You can email me. That's my website. I'm not here to promote my business necessarily, but you can contact me through my website. I have a bunch of business cards right in front of Nick there. Raise your hand, Nick. That you can feel free to grab. Reach out to me on Facebook, phone, email, whatever. Even if you have a question that seems simple, I'm happy to connect with you guys. And I think that's it. Thank you. You guys have any questions? We got 3 minutes of questions. Yeah.
With regard to immune and inflammatory modulation for receptor binding, I would assume that would be a short-term effect. Is there a mechanism for a long-term effect, or would you have to take this psychedelic chronically to get that?
In my opinion, the way of making it long-term is getting rid of what's causing the chronic inflammation. That's what I was saying. Like, they're a tool. They're going to help you manage your inflammation and your immune dysfunction, but they're not going to cure it. What's going to cure it is getting rid of your stupid chronic infection or whatever. Yeah.
Is the ketamine being applied intramuscular?
It's administered intramuscular clinically. Obviously, some people put up their nose. Actually, clinically, I know there are forms of ketamine in nasal sprays that they are prescribing at this point, but in general, especially for the depression and PTSD research, it's intramuscular. Yeah.
I read an article by Dr. Russo many years ago. I think it came out in 2004 with this paper on clinical endocannabinoid deficiency for neurological conditions, including autoimmune disease dysfunctions. And so I started to treat a lot of my patients with certain dosaging of cannabis. And pretty much all those conditions can clear up, whether it be leaky gut syndrome, multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue, and so on. So I find that cannabis plays a remarkable role in the healing of all of these conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally used cannabis a lot as a medicine. I didn't include it because as much as I love cannabis, I'm not really an expert on it. It's not my forte, so, but yeah, cannabis, another good one.
First, I just want to say I love you and your enthusiasm. And also, my question is kind of, does it matter which psychedelic, and you can include cannabis in there, and microdosing versus macrodosing, and how much would you macrodose if you were going to, not quantity at one time, but how often? You know, like some people drink ayahuasca every 2 weeks, for example.
Right.
Or if you're microdosing every 4 days approximately.
Yeah. You know what would be great is if someone did a study and found out what the appropriate dose to get the clinical efficacy was, or the frequency. That's why we need more research, because like, I don't know, I can make up an answer that I think might work, but at the end of the day, like, we have the ability to actually find that out, and for whatever reason we haven't.
Well, is there anything in the literature about which psychedelic, like mushrooms versus LSD, or
pretty much everything that exists in the literature, to my awareness, I just presented.
Okay.
There's like a handful of papers that people are even speculating there might be immune modulation and an inflammation potential clinically. It's like, it's kind of, there haven't been a lot of direct studies yet. Everyone's kind of like, well, if you put this piece together with this, that seems like it would fit, but you can't necessarily make that assumption until you do a controlled, placebo, tight, rigorous study where you say, this person with this disease had these biomarkers reduced taking this dosage this often. Yeah.
Do you think there's room for children to benefit, maybe from cannabis or from psychedelics in general? Because I have a neurological autoimmune disorder and I've had it since I'm 6. And I think that if I was able to combat it early enough, and it, all the doctors that I saw kind of understood a little bit more of the underlying works of it, do you think there's any room? Because I know that they give ayahuasca to children, down in Peru and stuff. Yeah. If there's any room, what do you think?
Yeah, I think like any medication, you see if it's suitable for children, and I mean, there are questions about the effects on development, of course, but if your child is suffering with a disease or a disorder, that's not, who cares? Like, their quality of life is more important to their development anyways, So yeah, I think like any medicine, once properly vetted, it has its place in animals, people, elderly, like anyone that it's deemed safe for.
I know you mentioned, I think, harming in one of your slides, which is legal, right? It's from the vine, so that's one option.
Yeah, I think you can.
Ayahuasca's not illegal.
No, the ayahuasca vine is legal, but the DMT aspect is not.
Yeah, so I mean, you could buy some vine, cook it up, and yeah, totally. Also, passion flower has harmine and harmala alkaloids in it, so that's another really kind of an analog type plant that has harmine in it. Yeah.
A bit of a personal question for you. You're a missionary.
Yeah.
Did you use all the psychedelics that you mentioned yourself?
I've never used ibogaine.
Okay.
I've used LSD, mushrooms, ayahuasca, ketamine. I've never used any of the DO series or the 2C series. Mescaline, and it's also hard to separate out what was used for my physiological symptoms and what was part of my exploration with plant medicines in general. And to be honest, you know, the psychospiritual work that I was doing with the plant medicines was relevant to my physical healing, because I found that at the end of the day, yeah, I had gut infections, I had mold exposure. What really caused it was unprocessed childhood trauma that put my nervous system in this chronic flight or fight response that made me susceptible to opportunistic organisms and pathogens to just screw everything up. And yeah, I would say I'm like 95% in remission at this point. I do have kind of relapses here and there, but you know, I just went to Burning Man and I took pretty good care of myself, but I also had a great time. I partied pretty good, and so yeah, coming back, like, I'm not nearly as wrecked as I thought I should be. And to me, that's positive, but I do consider it a little bit of a relapse. Like, okay, I was able to go, like, you know, the last 6 weeks without any chronic fatigue symptoms, which is huge. I don't think I've ever in my entire life not identified as having chronic fatigue. And the last 6 weeks or so, I haven't really had chronic fatigue. And I, you know, I've had a little bit of fatigue since I returned from the burn on Monday. But to me, that is a sign of, like, the journey has been like this. It's been 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 8 steps sideways, jump up in the air, like, rub your belly, pat your head. It's been really, it's frustrating. It's you wonder if you're ever gonna get better. And I know a lot of people wonder that, and I know a lot of people aren't getting better, and you have to believe that someday you will get better, or else the pain and suffering of your daily life, you wouldn't be able to go on anymore. And that's a very real thing for people with chronic illness. And I'm certainly not saying that for anyone to feel bad for me. I'm one of the lucky ones. I figured it out, and that's why I want to help people that don't have a biology degree, they don't have the ambition and the drive and the support and the resources to figure it out, and they go through their lives wishing they were dead every day. And I know how that feels, and just knowing that I have gotten better and that other people can too is like truly inspiring, and I'm just happy to be on the other side of that and be able to offer those encouraging words to people that don't know if there's any hope for them.
Word.
All right, we're done?